on a tea plantation, brought to you by India. My name is Sejal Gopichkar, and I head there in the United Kingdom. Our guest is the lovely Husna-Tara Prakash. After attending in college in both England and India, during a backpacking expedition around the world, she met her husband, her now husband Anshuman Prakash, a fourth-generation tea planter. After returning to India to marry him, they spent 2 years on a tea plantation in Kerala where tourism was growing. And it was at this time that both of them conceived the idea of opening up tea estates to visitors, a little bit like vineyards do in other parts. In the summer of 2002, Husna and Bronwyn Latif, a talented designer from Delhi, lovingly restored the Bara bungalow at Glenburn and opened the Glenburn Estate as a boutique homestay near Darjeeling. 5 years later, the Tatler Travel included Glenburn in its list of the best 101 hotels in the world. The Prakash family's latest venture is a new hotel in the heart of the city, Calcutta, called the Glenburn Penthouse, which is an boutique hotel. Brand Glenburn, as I'm sure some of you know, is now recognized globally for its fine guest experience and attention to detail. That's the introduction from me. A little bit of a housekeeping notes. Please turn off your mics and sit back and enjoy Husna's presentation. It will take about 40 to 45 minutes, and we're hoping to have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So over to you.
Thank you, Sejal. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I'm very proud to be part of the rare community of sustainable and responsible hotels around India and some neighboring countries. And I'm really delighted to be here talking about tea today. Many of you have heard me talk about the story of Bengal and show you presentations about Glenburn Tea Estate and the Glenburn Penthouse. But here is a story about tea. It's something that I stumbled into, as Sejal said, when I married my husband, and the legacy of tea knowledge in our family is something really amazing to absorb myself into over the past 22 years. So I'm going to talk about tea because it's simply the most popular drink in the world after water. And would you believe it, that 25,000 cups of tea are drunk every second. 2.16 billion cups of tea are drunk. So it's an incredibly important beverage. And when people
instead of taking her to the
Hello, sorry.
I think we may be having some technical glitches. Please bear with us.
I'm back. Sorry. Did you lose?
Have you back? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we lost you for a few minutes, so maybe you'd like to start again.
Okay. So where did you lose me from? The first slide or the introduction?
From this, yeah, we didn't hear most of the first slide. So if you would please start again.
The first slide. Okay. So this 25,000 cups of tea a second and 2.16 billion cups of tea a day are drunk around the world. And that's why it's such an interesting beverage to hear the story about. And that's what our guests are truly amazed about when they visit Glenburn and they see the intricacies that go into making that cup of tea. So tea was discovered in China, and it was a very random event. There was the Emperor of China sitting under a tree with a cup of his hot water. A couple of leaves of the tree that he was sitting underneath fell into his cup. He smelt it, he tasted it, it smelled good, it tasted good, and that's how tea was born. It was as simple as that. But there are legends in India and Japan that talk about the Buddhist connection with tea, and they say that Prince Bodhidharma went out from India to spread the Buddhist religion, and he had sworn to himself that he would stay awake for sort of 6 or 9 years. But in the 3rd year, he started feeling a little bit sleepy, and fell asleep against a sort of a bush. And in the 3rd year, he started chewing these leaves, and it allowed him to sort of stay awake, proving that, tea had these sort of stay awake qualities that now we relate to caffeine. And then there's another slightly more gruesome story about how he was so upset that he in the 3rd year that he ripped his eyes out, threw them on the ground, and from there grew the first tea bush. So of course, tea has found its way into folklore to do with all sorts of things. But there's no doubt that it did start in China. And it was the Tang dynasty of the 8th century that really made it into the undisputed national drink. And it was first very popular in court circles, and then early cultivation was sort of developed. And they used to steam and then bake the tea, which still forms sort of the fundamental basis of tea. But the more tea was drunk, the more wealthy circles sort of made it into something that was very expensive, very sought after. And even in those days, if tea was grown at a higher altitude, it was more valuable. And there was a sort of in Mt Ming in Szechuan, there was a tea that was so rare that it came from only 7 teas and only 90 leaves were plucked in the entire year. And it also led to a lot of society pressures. So it had to be boiled in the right water, heated over the right charcoal, brewed in the right utensils. And they had these tea masters that ensured that there was no error that led to a loss of face when you were trying to serve tea in your homes. And these tea masters were very well respected in society. And it was associated with art, with beauty, with poetry. And there was one writer, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, that even talked about how the water had to be boiled perfectly. And I'll just read out what he wrote. He said, when the water is boiling, it must look like fish's eyes and give off but the hint of a sound. When at the edge, it chatters like a bubbling sprint and looks like innumerable pearls strung together, it has reached its 2nd stage. When it leaps like majestic breakers and resounds like the swelling wave, it has hit its peak. Any more, and the water will be overboiled and should be not used and thrown away. So that's how technical boiling the water was. And if you think about us just putting on the kettle and chucking in a tea bag, we've sort of come a long way from the art of making tea as it was done in China. And the emperor, of course, got the best tea. So he had 30,000 workers that were employed only to make his tea. And they used to work in the early morning when it was misty and the leaves were dried in the sun before dawn. The plucking gangs sort of used these cymbals and drums to keep the rhythm. And there were extraordinary precautions so that the tea wasn't spoiled when it was picked. The women, often they were virgins. They weren't allowed to eat garlic, onions, and strong spices. They had golden scissors, and there were even girls that would walk after them with jugs of water to clean their fingernails. So that was how the sort of first wave of tea drinking was characterized in China. Then you had the Sung dynasty that were the next change the style in which tea was made. So instead of steaming and baking it, they would, when they were preparing it, they would boil the leaf first, and then they would boil the water first, put the leaves in and let it brew, which is similar to how we do it today. And then after that, they would whisk it. And that whisking is something that spread to Japan on the basis of the Japanese tea ceremony. The Japanese tea ceremony, of course, is something that even today, when you go to Japan, you can indulge in. And it's a beautiful ceremony that's associated with meditation and geishas and a Zen-like beauty. It's basically restricted to green tea most of the time, and the tea is often brewed a number of times with a lot of ceremony, and it's a really beautiful experience if you ever go there. The next dynasty was the Ming dynasty, and this was the dynasty where ceramic started being used as a domestic sort of product, and eventually led to the creation of the teapot. In the beginning, when ships would travel across the world, ceramic was often used to line them because they were wooden ships, and the cargo, instead of it being oiled with the water sort of coming through the wood, the ceramic would protect the valuable cargo. But when it started being associated with tea, ceramic also started becoming very valuable. So that was quite an interesting kind of parallel. And fine porcelain was eventually shipped to the West along with tea. And that link remains till today. And it was only in the 17th century when tea actually found its way to the West. So it was very, very recent. And it was often in brick form, but mainly in loose form when it came to Europe. But it was something very, very new. The Dutch, the French drank it far before the English did. The English were actually the last Europeans to drink it. And it was stored and sort of transported as loose tea. And a couple of the teas were also flavored. But it was eventually the black tea that came to dominate Western taste. But the first reference to it was in an Italian traveler's book. And he talks about this herb that they drink dry or fresh, they boil it. And 1 or 2 cups of this decoction, it was still known as a decoction, taken on an empty stomach will remove fever, headache, stomach aches, pain in the side or joints, and should be taken as hot as you can bear. So that's basically how it was perceived in those early days. But the Dutch sort of started with it. And in France, it was very fashionable in the court of Louis the sort of 13th and then the 16th. And he had a teapot of pure gold. But the person that was responsible for bringing it into England was Catherine Braganza, who married the King of England in 1662. And she was responsible for bringing a lot of things to England. She brought the fork. So people never used a fork in England before she arrived. In her dowry came this chest of tea, which was to change England forever. And also high tea was a concept that she brought to England. And very importantly for India and for the British Empire, she also brought the port of Bombay and the port of Tangier in Africa. So without her, Bombay would never have come to the English. But tea was definitely something that was very important in her dowry. So that's when the English started drinking tea. And very soon it started becoming the most fashionable drink that there was. The other European countries actually went back to drinking wine, but the English stuck with their tea. And no one can really explain why it became so fashionable, but it just did. So the government had to sort of react to this rising fashion. And there were patterns of oversupply and undersupply, and taxes played a very, very big role. So it was very highly taxed because they could obviously see that there was a lot of money that could be got from it. And this created a sort of illegal supply of tea that was also coming. And there were a lot of people that were smuggling it into the city, into the country. And if you think about the retail price, it ranged from £1 to £3 per pound, so sterling pound per pound of tea. And a skilled craftsman in those days would only earn £1 a week, and a labourer would earn 40 pence a week. So to spend 1 or 3 or up to £3 on a little pound of tea was something that was really quite precious in those days. But it was seen as a medicine stimulant, and people used to say that it would make you lively and active, drive off sleep, and every drinker of it cannot but be sensible. So it had this sense of, the caffeine was obviously something that was creating this very, also interestingly, because it was a hot drink, it stopped a lot of the stomach problems that people were having at that time, because the hot water obviously did away with some of the bacteria that was in the community. A lot of stomach things also sort of started stomach illnesses started getting better as the English started drinking more and more tea. But the concept of afternoon tea was something that came afterwards, but it was the Duchess of Bedford who she used to develop a sinking feeling in her stomach between lunch and dinner. So she started having a cup of tea, and then she started inviting friends over, and they also enjoyed the fact that they could fill their afternoon with this cup of tea. And that's how afternoon tea became a tradition in England and has now spread to the world. But it was the clipper ships that were designed to bring the harvests over from China to England, and ship design was actually modified to help these ships get to England as fast as they could. And there were races across the world to sort of get the first harvest to the London tea auction. And as I said before, the taxes kept going higher and higher. Smuggling also started going higher. And it's interesting how there are many similarities even with the trade of cannabis, because it was something that was blessed by society. Everybody wanted it, but it was being illegally imported at the time, and the government was having a big problem trying to maintain the fact that it was being adulterated. Initially, it was just green tea that was to make it look greener, they would put in these sort of chemicals and other things to look blacker. And in one of the years when they had an oversupply, colonial America was on the verge of protesting against the British rule, but the taxes were so high on the tea, and it was being forced because they had oversupply here. And that led to what's famous as the Boston Tea Party. So they basically boarded one of the British ships that had a huge cargo of tea waiting to be sold to the Americans, and they chucked it into the harbor. And even today, the Boston Tea Party is associated with many sort of political events. But it was linked to the monopoly that the East India Company and England had on the tea. So eventually, William Pitt, who was the Prime Minister of England at the time, said, okay, I need to do something about this. And he reduced the tax on tea. And when he reduced the tax of tea, the tax dropped from about 119% to 12.5%. And this stopped the smuggling virtually overnight. And within 10 years, the exchequer of the government benefited because the consumption of the tax tea at a lower rate far helped the tax that was being collected. And an interesting story that's linked to this reduction of the tea tax is the fact that to compensate for this, he added something called window tax, which meant that if you had 10 windows in your house, you were taxed more than if you had 1 or 2 windows in your house. If you often drive through the countryside, you'll see these old houses with windows bricked up. And that's possibly where the term daylight robbery comes from. So that tax was introduced at the same time that the tax was dropped. So the English and the Chinese, they had a very interesting relationship because the English really needed this tea from them. And the Chinese were a very inward-facing nation. They had pretty much everything. The only thing that the English could offer them was a bit of cotton from India, but even that was nothing in the quantity compared to the amount of tea that the English needed to get back to their country. So there was this period when two flowers came to rule world commerce and trade. One was, of course, the tea flower, Camellia sinensis, and the other was the opium flower. Now, the opium flower was used to sell to the Chinese, and it was created into this addictive drug that they had to buy, and it created a huge addiction in the country. They produced it in India, sold it to the Chinese so that they could get silver that they could give back to the Chinese to buy tea. It was this really bizarre kind of trade situation that was happening. And it was basically the dried juice of this unripe seed in the capsules of the opium poppy that created this ability for the English to get silver back and buy tea, because the Chinese only wanted silver. They didn't want any other traded goods from the English. They had enough of everything. They just wanted the silver. And it reached a really terrible situation in the early 1800s, where the opium addiction had affected pretty much all of the population. And this led to the Opium Wars. And there were a series of them, and they led to all sorts of consequences, where Hong Kong was permanently lost to the English, to the British, and there were pirates and robbers and a lot of battles. And eventually the Chinese emperor, said enough is enough, and the British had to find something else to do. So the East India Company, that was the company that was really ruling trade at that time and was the precursor of the British Raj and the British Empire in India. They'd come to India in sort of the 1599. They started sailing off to the east, and by 1707 and then 1757, when we had the Battle of Plassey, they had become pretty much rulers of India. And by the early 19th century, the governors were ruling not just Calcutta, where they set up their headquarters, but also defeated Tipu Sultan in Mysore. They'd, even the King of Lucknow got exiled to Calcutta because they took over his country as well, his little sort of kingdom as well. And by that time, they knew that the only way they could continue producing tea back to England and their sort of people was to find a way to grow it in India, because they realized that it was just not possible with the Chinese anymore. So it was very interesting because a botanist was sent into China, and the book at the bottom of the screen for all the tea in China talks about this botanist, Robert Fortune, who goes into China dressed as a Mandarin, and he manages to find out what this plant was all about. initially, people even thought that green tea came from one plant and black tea came from another plant. But when he went there, he realized that it was actually the same plant for the first time. And he brought thousands of these plants out of China and sailed them off to India for further cultivation. And he was able to do this because he had invented this device called the bell jar, which allowed him to seal a plant in a glass jar and not have to water it for months and months and months. So he could do a 6-month-long journey with these sealed sort of glass boxes which contained tea plants, and they survived. So he sailed these Chinese tea plants off into India. And at the same time, they also found an indigenous tea plant in India in the region of Assam. So they found a local tea bush, and they also had this Chinese tea bush that they were able to, and it was quite a story, the fact that he went in and found this sort of secret formula to the world's favorite drink. So that was how the sort of Assam tea plantation began. Assam was a long, flat river valley in the northeast of India. Dense forests, swamps, excessive rainfall, high humidity. So it was perfect for growing tea, and of course the indigenous tea that they found out there as well. The Assamese were very open to the English coming in there because the Ahom tribes that lived there at the time wanted protection against other neighboring Southeast Asian countries that were sort of threatening to attack them. So they allowed the English to come in. The problem was that there were no people to pick the tea. So they had to bring people from Orissa and Bihar out to the plantations there to plant and eventually run the tea estates over there. And similarly in Darjeeling, up in the hills, which was one of the other regions that they developed tea in, they had to bring workers from neighboring Nepal into that area. And even today we have 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Nepali tea planters. Just as in Assam, we have 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Bihari planters who were brought out up the river to these places. And they are today the sort of citizens of that part of India. So you had the Assam plantations and the Chang Bungalows. And I know one of the rare hotels, Wild Marcia, is a typical Assamese Chang Bungalow. And then you had tea in the shadow of Mt Kanchenjunga. And this is the view from Glenburn Tea Estate. And I'll show you more of these views later on, but it was really a fantastic place to tea. And the Chinese variety did thrive up here. So this map sort of shows you the different tea regions at that time. The Kangra region is where the lodge at Y is, and Husna-Tara Prakash will be talking about that later on today. Dehradun, to the right of that, funnily enough, that's where our family actually originated with their tea estates. And it was only after things sort of changed climatically and geographically in Dehradun that we had to sort of shut those plantations down because it became unviable. And the family shifted out to Calcutta and started owning tea estates in the other parts of India, including Assam, Darjeeling, and also the Duars. The word Duars actually means doors, Duar, and it was a series of sort of doors and gates which had trading interactions between India and sort of neighboring countries, and that's how that area was sort of named. Sylhet is now in Bangladesh, and Kachar is still a part of Indian tea. But these, and then of course in the south, you had tea in the Nilgiri Hills and in Kerala as well. So Darjeeling is quite interesting. These are the 87 tea estates in Darjeeling. It has geographical indexing. So just like champagne can only come from Champagne, Darjeeling tea can only come from these 87 tea estates. And if you look at Glenburn on the top right-hand corner, you can see it's on the border of Sikkim. It's got rivers flowing through it, and these white patches are all sort of private forests. So that's what makes it special. Now, just going back to the sort of historical significance of tea. So back in 1662 was when Catherine Braganza brought that chest in her dowry, and 2 years later they had the first English tea auction. In 1685 it had risen to £12,000, and just 5 years later from 12,000 it had become 38,000 pounds of tea. And then in 1721 you can see how much the legal import was compared to the illegal import, and it's almost 3 times the illegal import. Then you had the Boston Tea Party, the reduction of the tea tax, and suddenly within 10, 12 years it had jumped up to 23 million pounds. So that just shows you why the English were desperate to sell their opium to the Chinese, and why they had to find another way to grow it. And that's how it came to India. So in 1901, you had 200 million pounds. At independence, you had 560 million pounds. And the last figures I got were from 2017, where this should actually be KG, 11 1,600 million kgs, not pounds. I apologize for that. So the many producers of tea, you've got India and China as the bigger ones, but many other parts of the world produce tea as well. These are some of the top countries. And it was interesting when I was researching this a couple of days ago, I read about tea production in Iran. And just like that, English botanist went into China disguised as a Mandarin to discover the secret of tea. The Prince of Iran actually came into India disguised as a French laborer to discover the history of tea, the how tea was grown. And he took some plants back to Iran from India, having come disguised as a French laborer. So there was a lot of espionage happening, all thanks to this incredible plant. So Camellia sinensis, this is what it looks like. It was first a tree, and now it's a bonsai. We make it into a bonsai, so it's convenient for our pickers to pick the tea. So if you let it grow wild, the bushes would become tea and forests. And I'm just going to play a short video to show you, this is actually from Glenburn. Sorry, just try and find the, oh. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the arrow. There it is. Okay.
This is Glenburn, a heavenly estate in the foothills of the Indian Himalayas, where tea has thrived for 150 years. This is the home of Darjeeling tea, known around the world as the champagne of teas. Here at Glenburn, tea making is an art, and we stick to age-old traditions. 400 women from Glenburn's 8 villages set out each morning to pick tender tea shoots. 1,000 of these make just a pound of tea. Only the most delicate of fingers can pick the leaves without bruising them. Their gentle touch ensures that the exquisite flavors, nurtured by the region's rich soil, life-giving rains and warm sunshine, remain pure. Every stage in the manufacturing of Glenburn tea is lovingly guided by hand by the people who have lived and worked here, making our award-winning tea for generations. Skills passed from mother to daughter and father to son. No shortcuts, meticulous attention to detail, and passionate commitment to the highest levels of quality. Experience Glenburn tea. There's true craftsmanship in every cup.
Okay, so that was just a little bit of an insight into the tea making process, and I'll try and talk you through it. So these are sort of the basic processes that one goes through. So you pick 2 leaves in a bud, and that's a picture of the 2 leaves in a bud that you pick. These are the tea pickers that pick our tea, and then it's weighed in the field by a supervisor, and then transported back to the factory. And about 1,000 of these tender shoots make just a pound of tea. So that sort of gives you an idea of how much green leaf is made into the actual made tea. Now, these are the withering troughs. So the tea is laid out here, sometimes overnight, sometimes for longer. And hot air is blown through it so that it dries and all the moisture content is reduced. And depending on the type of tea that you're making and the weather conditions, the extent of the withering will vary. And in this slide, you can see a rolling machine on the right-hand side. And that's a process that was once done by hand, but now it's mechanically accomplished. And basically what you're doing is you're rupturing the cells so that the good components of the tea, the antioxidants, the phytonutrients, are released. And that's what gives you the aroma and the flavor, and also the make of your tea leaves. So again, the drum that you can see over here can be raised or lowered to give a high pressure or low pressure roll. And then you determine how long you want to roll the tea, again, depending on what the type of tea you're making is. And then after the cells have been ruptured, as you can see on the front of the slide, the tea is just laid out on a bed and it's left to oxidize. And literally you're wanting the ambient air, the oxygen, to react with all those enzymes and nutrients, sorry, not the enzymes, the nutrients and the chemicals in the tea leaves to do their job in making that flavor and that aroma that is such an interesting drink to drink. So it's known as fermentation. There's nothing actually added to ferment it. It's actually oxidation. and for some reason it's known as fermentation. And sometimes you'll only want to ferment it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and sometimes you'll need to ferment it for an hour and a half. So again, depending on the strength of the tea, the light are fermented for less time. The stronger teas in Assam are fermented for a longer period of time. And a white tea or an oolong tea is either not fermented at all or semi-fermented. So that's what makes those teas different from black teas. And once the fermentation is over, the oxidation is over, it's carried over to a dryer. I'm sorry, I didn't have a picture of a dryer, but this is a picture of the tea coming out of that machine on the right-hand side, which is the dryer. And the dryer basically raises the temperature to a point where the enzymes in the leaf are killed. And once the enzymes are killed, the reactions that are taking place to sort of make the flavors and the aroma are stopped. So once the enzymes are killed, whatever your flavor was is kept in the leaf, and that's what we want. So when it comes out of the dryer, it has this incredible smell, and sometimes it smells really caramelly, and it's warm, and it's a really lovely sort of experience. And then it's taken to the sorting room. It returns to the gentle hands of the women once again, and it's either hand sorted, as we would do often in Darjeeling for expensive teas, or it's put through machines, sifting machines and sorting machines that will grade it into different sizes for different markets. And this sort of shows you the very fine tea, the dust that would go into tea bags, and the larger teas, which are known as the whole leaf teas or the orthodox teas that would be drunk whole. So each of these different grades would come out of a single batch of tea, and they would be sold to different markets for different purposes. And when people often ask me what orange pico is or TGFOP, these are all different grades or sizes of tea. So TGFOP would be tippy, flowery, golden, orange pico, which are all descriptions of these different teas. Now we also have what we call the designer teas. So we have silver needle and oolong and moonshine and things like that that are packed in special chests like this. Often tea is packed in sacks, but the really special teas are packed in wooden chests so that the flavor and the make of the leaf isn't broken. And then of course you have the tea tasting session. So you weigh out a specific amount of tea, and it's taken out into these cups. Sorry. Did you miss? I'm sorry, I think I pressed that by mistake. So just going back to this slide, that once the tea is laid out, it's tasted, and then based on the characteristics of the tea, we will modify the future production, or we will simply price it at a price that we feel the tea really deserves. And this tea is very interesting because it shows the different seasons of Darjeeling. Now, Assam tea, Sri Lankan tea, Kenyan tea, it generally looks the same. It's a thick, strong, malty cup. Sometimes you'll have a second flush in Assam, but it generally looks the same. Whereas in Darjeeling, you have 7 distinct types of tea that come out of the same bush, and 4 different seasons. And you can see them in the colors over here. Yeah, so this is drink tea in harmony with the season. So you have the spring teas that come in March. The tea bushes wake up from their winter sleep. So there's the tea bushes don't really give us any leaf between November and March because of the weather. It's too cold. Whereas in tea plantations in Africa, which are closer to the equator, and also in South India, you have tea being produced 12 months of the year. But up in Darjeeling and Assam, it's only from March to November. But in Darjeeling, you have a different type of tea in March called the first flush. And then the same tea bush, even though it's being picked every 7 days, 7 to 10 days, will give you a different tasting tea in the summer, in sort of late May, early June, and a different tasting tea in the monsoon months. And then finally, what we call the autumn crescendo, which is again a different type of tea in autumn. And this will show you how the greenness of the first flush changes, and the look of the liquor is so different to the same bush giving a different tea. And this is why a different tea in the autumn. And this is why Darjeeling is known as the champagne of teas, because of this variation and very small quantities of tea also that come out of these 80-70 estates that need to be sold at a higher price because the quantity is so low during the year. These are the silver needles, the autumn, the oolongs, and the green teas. Now, green tea is basically made in a similar process, but without any oxidation at all. So you steam or you bake or you heat the tea to kill the enzymes as soon as you withered and rolled it. So there is no fermentation at all, no oxidation. and it's a product that does have caffeine. A lot of people think that green tea doesn't have caffeine. It often has more caffeine than black tea because it's such a pure form of tea that comes straight from the bush. Now, in Assam, we have more malty looking teas. You can see the difference between the Darjeeling teas and these Assam teas. And the CTC on the right is also something I'll talk about in a bit. The CTC means cut, tear, and curl. So tea tasting is an interesting thing for people to enjoy. Now, masala chai and CTC, this is something that's very interesting because if you ask an Indian, what did your great grandparents drink? They'll probably say tea because everyone drinks tea. Everyone drinks tea in India. But actually, people did not start drinking tea in India until as late as the 1920s. And the reason why tea started being drunk in India by the Indians and not the English was because the English actually couldn't sell their tea back in England because of the depression that took place after World War I. They had an oversupply of tea and they didn't know what to do with it. So they said, okay, let's try and sell it to the Indians. So they launched these really interesting campaigns with the Indian government to show how fashionable it was to drink tea. And you can see these wonderful vintage posters of Mem Saabs with tennis rackets and teacups and even linked to the independence movement. But what probably happened was that an Indian housewife said, oh, I can't be bothered with all this paraphernalia and the fine china, and I want something a little bit sort of, with a little bit more gutsy. So she threw some tea leaves into a pestle and mortar, probably crushed it up, added some ginger and cardamom maybe, boiled it in milk, added lots of sugar, and that's how she made the first batch of masala tea. Now, when that happened, the producers actually had to find a way of creating something that imitated what she'd made in the kitchen. So they made these new machines called CTC machines, which are called cut, tear, and curl. And then they were able to make this sort of more granular looking tea that had a higher surface area. And then they were able to create the stronger tea that is now famous as masala chai. But really interesting. And the tea bag was actually invented by mistake. It was Thomas Sullivan was a New York trader who sent out gifts of tea in small silken bags to his customers. And they started dipping them in water. And they didn't realize that it was just a gift bag. And that's how the tea bag was born. And of course, the English frowned upon this from across the Atlantic. But very soon they became big drinkers of tea bags as well. So that's how the tea happened. But afternoon tea is now something that is very much a tradition at Glenburn, also at the Glenburn Penthouse. And it's something that I really think everybody should enjoy more of today when we have too much technology and dependence on phones and a lack of conversation. A tea party is really a wonderful way to connect with people, again, including children, and it's an easy thing to do. And a great book that I read some years ago, it became slightly controversial later on, but the singular message that he had about these 3 cups of tea was about how when you sit down to have your first cup of tea with somebody, you're pretty much a stranger. But if you have the patience to sit and have a second cup of tea, you become their friend. And if you have the patience to sit down and have a third cup of tea, you become like family. So if you have the time in your lives, especially during the lockdown, but even in the future, to take the time to spend time with people, even if you have 3 cups of tea, you'll probably end up becoming very close to them. So just quickly going into what Glenburn is, this is the 4 generations of our family that were one of the first to own tea estates in India. Darjeeling and Assam, these are the 2 growing regions, and we're Rainforest Alliance certified, but we're very proud of the fact that we scored 100% for wildlife protection and community relationships, and this is why Glenburn is so special. So when Condé Nast Traveler visited us many years ago, this is what they said about it. It's like visiting a corner of heaven and almost as remote. It's a unique collection of landscapes, gastronomy, cultures. It's 1,600 acres of private estate looking up at the 3rd highest mountain in the world. It has 2 rivers, a community of 1,000 workers, and its environmental diversity is really something we're very proud of. So if you look at this slide, it actually has the same amount of tea and more protected forest on it. So that's the kind of diversity that we have. And these are some slides that show you the fauna and the flora, and of course the community. So if you think about 1,000 of these shoots being plucked by hand and making just 1 pound of tea, translate this into world production. Think about that human face behind the cup of tea that you drink every day. This is a picture from our Assam tea estate, but it really does show you the dependence that we have on the community and how integral they are to making the tea. And our relationship is very close to them. We provide housing, medical care, subsidized food rations, pension funds. They say from mother's milk when you're born to firewood when you die. the plantation provides that for every worker that lives within the estates. And this is an example of a 4-generational family. Ranjan, if any of you have visited the hotel, you might have met Ranjan. These are his grandparents, his parents, and now he has 2 children, in fact. And his grandparents remember their parents planting the first bushes at Glenburn, which is very special. Now, women form 80% of the workforce. And we also have an education program. So we work with 3 local schools, and we also provide scholarships for children to private schools. And I'll just play you a very short video just to show you the beautiful spirit that runs through these communities. So that was a beautiful glimpse into one of the primary schools during one of the holidays when we were preparing for the annual Glenburn Festival. So it's a very, very special environment. And we have 64 children who are in private schools now. And Nikita, who started with us when she was in nursery, is currently this year studying in class 12. In 2014, she made it to Student of the Year, then went on to school captain. And, she started with us when she was 5 years old, and now she's almost 18 and going out into the world to conquer it, we hope. We also promote local culture with dances and local sort of music and dance. And our Glenburn Festival is something that's very special that we organize every year to celebrate this talent. Now I'm going to play a short video from the festival, but I'm going to jump through it because we're sort of running out of time. Just find the play button. There we go.
family. And there is the group of people that you know and you love and you enjoy.
नानीले किन शुद्ध भयो फेरि उनीहरूले सम्झाउनु भयो परिवार दुई प्रकारको हुन्छ एउटा जो आमा बुवाहरू हुन्छन् अरू बाँकी जो साथीहरूको साथमा वा जो फ्रेन्डहरूको साथमा तपाईँ उठबस गर्नुहुन्छ त्यो प्रकारको तपाईँहरूको साथमा एउटा परिवारै नै हो
See that there's a huge family, not just father and son, not just wife, but a huge family that extends well beyond biology. This is a special place. My heart is warmed.
You have provided us with more than we could ever ask for. Food, water, a home, and education. Something to aspire and dream about. For this, I and all my friends would like to dedicate this song to you, our friends, our family, our sunshine.
Okay, so we even have a Glenburn Anthem, and that's a wonderful festival that if any of you ever visit during February, will have the chance to enjoy. So I know I'm running out of time, but very quickly I'll take you through the Glenburn Boutique Hotel that has been open now for almost 20 years. Started as a little 4-room experiment from the Borough Bungalow, and now has 8 rooms and encompasses 2 bungalows, the Borough Bungalow and also the Water Lily Bungalow. So I'll just quickly take you through the rooms. They're all quite large with extra single areas for families. The Kanchenjunga suite, even the Simbong room, which is our smallest room, has this fabulous view in the morning when dawn rises. The Water Lily Bungalow, which has this veranda on the upper level looking up to Darjeeling town on the top of the hill. And if you walk down the stairs at the side and enter that little doorway, you'll come down to this suite, the Rungdung suite, and lovely views of the mountains. Each room is different. Each room has different views. We have green tea toiletries that we use, and lots and lots of food. All our meals are specially created, and dinners are really a place for people around the world and around the country to interact with our hosts and also with other guests. And this is one of the most special parts of Glenburn. We also do private dining as well, bonfires in the evening, breakfast under the pomelo tree or in front of the mountains, lots of fresh produce, vegetables, herbs. We make our own bread and brownies. We surprise cakes and champagne on celebrations. And then, of course, the activities that take you through the tea fields, to 1,000 acres of private forest, down to the River Rangit, which borders Sikkim. This is our log cabin, where you can also come and spend the night or simply just spend the day, paddle in the river. This was a yoga group, visited even during the monsoon. We have a fishing program that conserves the golden mahseer. And the black and white picture shows of a mahseer that was caught by one of our managers in the 1920s. You can spend the night down here as well. You can walk into Sikkim across this bridge. You can explore the villages, bamboo groves. This is another river, the Rungdung, where we do picnics. And you can swim in this river as well. You can hike up to the top of the hill and look across to the mountains. You can visit Darjeeling town. That's about an hour away. The Darjeeling Hill Railway, the Goom Monastery, the Mountaineering Institute. Kalimpong is 2 hours away with a twice-weekly market, a monastery, and lots of orchid nurseries. And the local influences from Buddhist, colonial, the Tibetans, the Lepchas, it's just such a special place. We have cooking classes in the evenings, massages. And this is the wonderful team that choreographs everything for you up at Glenburn. Bertie and Audrey Amritanand and Rudolph John, who are really the heart and soul of Glenburn. And they will sit with you and work out everything that you will be doing during your stay with us. They'll plan menus, they'll solve problems, they're going to make sure that each room is immaculately cleaned now with this post-COVID time of extra sanitation. And they're going to ensure they're up there right now. They're going to be there all summer, and they are ensuring that our hotel is open and ready for you to come when you're able to travel. But the backbone of the community is really the staff that we use to work at Glenburn, and there are 55 of them looking after only 8 rooms. And the cooks, the gardeners, the guides, the drivers, the bearers, they're all from the local villages. We don't have anyone from hospitality management school, and this is something that we are so proud of. And this is really why this year we were awarded the most responsible hotel in India. 2 years ago we got the Outlook Award for the best luxury resort, but we were very proud to receive this honor this year for being one of the most responsible hotel in India. Way back in 2006, the Tata Travel Guide included us in the best 101 hotels of the world, and that's when we started taking ourselves a bit seriously. So thank you for all the support over these past 20 years. And visiting really does connect you with that cup of tea that you drink every morning. Now, we brought the Glenburn Experience to Calcutta 12 years ago with our private excursions of the city, but 2 years ago we opened the Glenburn Penthouse, and it looks on to Victoria Memorial, just like at Glenburn, we look on to Mt Kanchenjunga. But I wanted to show you how we brought the tea story into this hotel too. So if you look close at the quilts, that's the Camellia tea flower print, printed in Jaipur using 7 layers of block print, one on top of the other to create this. And on the pillow covers, you should be able to see the 2 leaves and a bud that has been hand embroidered onto the pillow covers as well. And also inlay marble. Bronwyn Latif, who has designed both my hotels for me, is a complete magician. The way she's been able to weave the tea motif into everything has been phenomenal. This is our infinity pool that looks out onto Victoria Memorial. This is our drawing room, our living room. Beautiful wallpaper from Paris, afternoon tea services. You can sit out on the tea terrace, look out over the green expanses of the Maidan, the race course, the 2 bridges. And then return to the luxury of your rooms. They have private dressing rooms, beautiful bathrooms, but it's the attention to detail that we're very, very proud of. And accompanied by our private excursions where we have cultural hosts, my colleague Noyana Ganguly and myself take people around the city, discovering experiences, drinking masala chai, interacting with locals, and really discovering the beauty of Bengal. So these are our sort of 3 products now that we brand as the Glenburn Experience in Bengal. The tea estate that opened 19, 20 years ago, the penthouse that opened 2 years ago, and Glenburn Private Excursions, which combines that, along with the other amazing game changers in the east of India that you can also combine a stay with. So Bari Koti in Murshidabad, Rajbari just outside Calcutta, the Bhanjdeo sisters in Mayurbhanj have also created an amazing experience out in Orissa. And the Assam Bengal navigation cruises up the river, where Antara Fukan is working to create magical experiences up the rivers, as she has done for a very long time on the Brahmaputra as well. So come out to the east, discover tea, discover Bengal, and discover all the game changers that are really making sustainable, responsible tourism. Thank you, Rare. Sorry if I've overstepped my time, but thank you, Sejal.
Thank you, Husna. That was absolutely amazing. Typically during these sessions, we have a lot of questions, but this time I think everybody's been listening with such rapt attention and so keenly hanging to every word that there have been no questions, quite to my surprise. Thank you. The lecture was informative. It was fascinating. The history buff in me is very, very happy. For everything that you told us about the tales of tea. Towards the end, it was lovely to see the aspects of the community and all the friendly, smiley faces, because so much of the experience of a place is about the people, right? So it was
happiness. I must say a really interesting story many years ago when I was trying to get ourselves certified by, I don't know, there's all this fair trade and Rainforest Alliance, and people would come and audit us and they would say, but you don't have anything on paper. You don't have the posters, you don't have the signs, you don't have the files, but your people look happier than any other tea estate we visit. But they wouldn't give us the stamp because, I wasn't equipped enough to do the paperwork. So now finally we get by the Rainforest
No,
Alliance.
but yeah,
that
I
was-
think the smiling people really are a testament, to the hospitality in Glenburn. So once again, thank you very much. It's raining compliments in the chat box, which I will share with you later. But thank you for doing a lovely presentation for us, and thank
there
you
are
for
more tales of coming at 6 o'clock on Instagram with Husna-Tara Prakash, who is my sister-in-law and one of the extended Chaiwala family, and she will be talking about her amazing tea estate up in Palampur, which is also a beautiful place to visit as well.
Thank you. I was just about to say that, Husna, so thank you. And thank you everybody that joined us. I think at one point we had about 135 from the UK all the way to Australia and everywhere in the middle as well. So very much for being there.
Wonderful. Well, I'll just say hello to everyone now that I'm thinking about my screen off. But thank you for joining us. I can see lots of familiar faces, and thanks for waking up. Beth, I think you woke up in New York City very early in the morning to listen to us, and great to see all of you. Thank you.
All the best from Paris.